Right Buddy here from Back Road Buddies of Red Tail Lodge, and the video we want to share with you today is about our upgrade to lithium batteries part 2. So in this video we're going to explain what our electrical system in our camper van looked like before the upgrade, then what changes we made during the upgrade, kind of walk you through our installation process and how much it all cost us. So if you want to know why we chose lithium and why we chose the Lion Safari UT 1300 batteries in particular, you can go back and look at our part 1 video. Now let's get the disclaimer out of the way. We are not experts. Do your own research. Consult experts. This is not a how-to instructional video. I mean, we hope you get useful information out of it. But don't do anything outside of your comfort zone or skill level, and most importantly, be safe. Okay, let's start with explaining what our electrical system in our camper van was before the lithium upgrade. So up here is basically what came with our 2018 Ford Transit passenger van. So there's an alternator in the engine that converts the mechanical energy of the crankshaft into electricity, and that's basically what powers all the electrical systems in the vehicle. Such things as like your headlights, your turn signal, your power windows, whatever that's which came with the passenger van. And that also includes these 12-volt sockets in the dash, which we sometimes use, that came with it. And in addition, it'll charge the starter battery. Now, the alternator only generates power while the engine is running. So when the engine is off, all the power gets drawn from the starter battery. So you can put, some things won't work when the engine's off, but if you turn the key in the ignition to the accessory mode, then you can run things like the radio. But if you run those too long, you can actually drain your starter battery down to the point where you can't start your engine. So that's not a good thing. Now, what's shown down below here is basically what VanDOit added to our camper van when they converted the 2018 Ford Transit passenger van into a camper van in 2019. So we kind of refer to this system as our house electrical system because it's our house inside of our van or our Red Tail Lodge. Now, when the engine's running, the alternator generally generates more electricity or has the capacity to generate more electricity than the vehicle electrical system can make use of. So VanDOit took advantage of that by using that to charge up these house batteries or AGM batteries in our battery bank. And this battery bank really is the center of this whole electrical system down here. So in order to charge these batteries from the engine alternator or the starter battery, they're kind of tied together, it used a Blue Sea Systems ACR, or automatic charging relay, which essentially just ties the starter battery to the battery bank. So it looks like one big battery bank, and the alternator will charge both systems while the engine is running. And then there's actually two other ways. So this is kind of the power inside. So there's two other ways we can charge up these batteries. We have two 170 watt solar panels up on the roof of our van that VanDOit installed. And that runs through a Go Power solar controller, which will charge the batteries from the electricity being generated by the solar panels. And the third way we can charge up these batteries is actually through what's called shore power. So there's an electrical plug on the outside of our van that you can hook up an extension cord to and hook up either to an outlet in your house or at a campground, electrical hookups. But that is AC power, so that's alternating current, where all of these systems in here are DC or direct current. So in order to charge up these batteries, there's this Go Power inverter charger, which converts the AC power into DC power to charge up those batteries. Now, this inverter charger has more functions than that. So we also have, looking on the power outside, or how we consume power, we do have AC outlets in the van that VanDOit installed, and also our rooftop Dometic air conditioner runs off of AC. So we need to generate AC, and that's what this inverter charger will do. So if we're not hooked up to shore power, it will draw DC current from the AGM batteries, convert it to AC, go out through these circuit breakers, and drive our AC circuits in our van. So we have AC outlets along the driver's side of the van that we use for our water heater and our refrigerator, and we also have a power strip along our kitchen pod, so that powers that. Another circuit goes up to our rooftop air conditioner. A third circuit goes to, there's a power strip and an AC outlet in and on our electrical cabinet. And then the fourth one is a AC outlet near the rear of their van on the passenger side by the back doors. So that's the AC, how we use AC. Now, this inverter charger will coordinate these functions together. So if we are plugged into shore power, it will do what's called a bypass. So the AC power won't have to go through the batteries to come back out to these AC circuits. It'll go directly from the AC in to the AC out. And if there's power left over from that, because we aren't using it all on our circuits here, it will take what's left over, convert it to DC, and charge the batteries. Likewise, if we are using more AC power than what's coming in on shore power, it will actually supplement that with DC power from the batteries to drive that AC out. So it's kind of a nice little gadget there. Now the other uses, I already mentioned there's 12-volt sockets in the dash that we still sometimes use those, especially when we're driving down the road. It's convenient to recharge our tire pressure monitoring system monitor, which is right there in the dash, or plug our phones in or whatever when we're going down the road. And then the other DC uses that we have in it, we actually have 3 rocker switches. There's one set above the driver, up above the dash. There's another set of rocker switches inside the electrical cabinet, and a third one in the rear of the van back by the back doors. And those rocker switches control things like, we have LED dome lights that we can turn on and off with those. There's red accent lights. There's cargo lights underneath the bed platform. Our water pump is hooked into there with a switch. And we also used one of the unused switches when we installed our WeBoost cell booster, and we have that being controlled off a rocker switch. So that's devices that are controlled with those switches. And then we also have this power from the batteries going through a fuse panel, and that powers things without switches. So we have a couple 12-volt sockets that VanDOit installed that we use. There was a circuit that powered the solar controller, and another one that powered a battery, what was it called? A battery isolation switch on the ACR was powered through the fuse panel. And there was other things like the carbon monoxide detector, But anyway, you get the idea. There's quite a few things in there. We also have we have a couple fuses that one goes to the S-bar heater to power the fan and the ignition and the fuel pump, and another one that goes to the S-bar heater controller, so it powers the display there. And those were things that we installed later. So we've added, so there's some empty fuse blocks in there that we've used. So that kind of gives the whole description of what it was before the upgrade. So what did we do to upgrade the system to lithium? Well, the obvious thing, of course, is we replaced these AGM batteries, and these were each 100 amp hour AGMs, and we replaced them with lithium. So we have 3 105 amp hour lithium batteries. They are Lion Safari UT 1300s. Now, you can somewhat run the system just by replacing the batteries. However, a lot of things don't really work properly. The first one is this ACR. As I said before, the ACR basically connects this battery bank with this starter battery, but now the starter battery is a lead acid and AGM's a lead acid. Lithium is not. It has different characteristics. So they do not recommend connecting these two together with an ACR. So Lion actually recommends what's called a DC to DC charger. So we pulled out this ACR and we put in a red arc. We chose red arc. There's quite a few brands out there. And we went with one of the popular brands. So this is a DC red arc DC to DC charger. Now it can handle the having two different voltages, one voltage on this side, a different voltage on that side, and it can handle the characteristics between the two systems. And they also recommended putting in 60 amp fuses, both on this connection from the starter battery and this connection to the lithium battery. So we actually bought the Red Arc 60 amp fuse kit, and that includes both fuses. Now the next thing that we changed was this GoPower solar controller. We actually had an older model, and there's battery profiles you can set in there, but ours was older and did not have a profile for lithium. It had, I think, for AGM and gel and flood or something like that, but it didn't have a lithium profile. So we really needed to do something different here. The newer, I think, models of their solar controller do handle lithium, but it also uses an older technology called PWM, or pulse width modulation. And it just so happens that the Red Arc DC to DC charger also has a solar controller included in it, and it uses MPPT, or maximum power point tracker, I think is what it stands for. It's a newer technology, usually a little more expensive, but it was already included in here. So we actually got rid of the GoPower solar controller and now connect our solar panels into here, and the DC to DC charger handles charging from both the alternator and the solar panels into the lithium. And it actually gives priority to the solar panels if you're reaching, maximum current you can put it through there. So that was that. The other thing that we added really has nothing to do with lithium. It was just a nice thing to do. It's called a Victron Smart Shunt, and we connected that into our battery bank, and what that does is it monitors the voltage and the current of the battery bank. and essentially the system. And you can connect it to your phone via Bluetooth, and they have an app on your phone so you can sit there and monitor your batteries. In addition, they sell a temperature probe that you can also connect up to it. So in addition to voltage and current, you can also monitor the temperature of the batteries. So we added that in there as well. And then the only other thing that we really needed to do was in the inverter charger. It also has battery profiles in there. It doesn't have one that explicitly says lithium. However, they do have a custom setting. So you go in and set the absorption and float voltages and the, I forgot, there was some other settings in there, and we actually discovered that we had overlooked one of the settings. The final charge actually needs to be set to float and not multi-stage for everything to work properly. So there's, if you look in our related blog post below, there's more details on what we actually set in there. So that was basically it. So now that's what our system looks like after the upgrade. So let's walk through the installation steps that we took. So I don't know if these are right or wrong, but it's what made the most sense to us. So first we de-energized the system. Now that meant disconnecting from the alternator, disconnecting from the solar panels, making sure we didn't have shore power plugged in, and turned off the inverter charger. We actually turned off all the breakers and pulled all the fuses. This was probably a little overkill, but we wanted to make sure there weren't any live wires inside that electrical cabinet, just to make it easier to work in there. Now, to disconnect from the alternator, we actually had to find the cable that came into the electrical cabinet, and we traced it all the way back into the engine compartment where it connected to the positive access terminal for the starter battery, and we disconnected it from there. So we wanted to disconnect the power as closest to the source as possible. And so to disconnect from the solar panels, we actually covered up the solar panels so they wouldn't be generating any electricity. We were hoping to disconnect the cables at the connector that's up on the roof, but because we couldn't really fit our hands underneath the solar panels enough to manipulate that, we actually disconnected the solar panels down at the solar controller inside of the electrical cabinet. And so then moving on to step 2, we opened up the electrical box, so the electrical cabinet where most of the devices and wires are that VanDOit installed. So we kind of disassembled that to the point where we could easily get to everything. And then so step 3, we disconnected the AGM batteries and removed them from the van. So at this point, there shouldn't be any live wires inside that electrical box. So we could rest a little easier. So then we removed all the devices that we weren't going to keep. So we removed the ACR, the automatic charging relay, and it also has a switch called the battery disconnect switch. So we removed that, and it's actually hooked into the fuse panel with a fuse. So we removed all that wiring up to the fuse block and we had already pulled the fuse, so we don't need to put that fuse back. So that'll be an unused slot. We also removed the solar controller, and it was also connected to the fuse block. So we removed all that wiring, so we didn't have any, just wiring dangling in there that wasn't being used for anything. So we removed all that. And then step 5 is we started mounting the new devices. So we mounted the DC to DC charger in the spot inside the electrical panel where the solar controller was, and routed the cables from there. We also mounted a power distribution block, and we put that about the same place as the ACR. Now the purpose for this was we have this great big huge 2-knot gauge wire cable coming from the alternator into the electrical box. So it's a big fat cable. And we needed to get it into the 60 amp fuse holder that came with Red Arc, and that would only accept I think up to like a 4 gauge or 3 gauge wire, which is much smaller. So we used the power distribution block, and it's so we could go from that large cable down to a smaller cable to hook into the 60 amp fuse holder. So we mounted the 2 fuse holders, one right near the power distribution block because that's where it'll be coming from, and another one over by the 12 volt bus bar. Now, in order to connect all this stuff together in the electrical box, there's 2 bus bars. There's the 12 volt bus bar, and then there's the ground bus bar. So everything kind of, the common point are those bus bars. So the battery bank comes through a Class T 300 amp fuse to that 12 volt bus bar. The same thing with the inverter charger, goes through one of those fuses, and the ACR used to go through one of those fuses, and we reused that to connect the DC to DC charger to the 12 volt bus bar. And then, of course, all the devices need a common ground, so they use that ground bus bar, and that ground bus bar is connected to another big black cable that goes down through the floor of the van and actually connects into the vehicle chassis, because on most vehicles, the electrical system, the common ground, is that metal vehicle chassis. And then we mounted the smart shunt inside the electrical box right near the battery bank, and then we secured the lithium batteries. They're slightly smaller footprint than the AGMs, so we actually took some aluminum angle and mounted it to the floor just to keep those lithium batteries from sliding around in the cabinet. So once we had all the devices, now we didn't wire anything yet because we really needed to figure out how long of wires and cables we needed, and we had some cables made. We made the cables for the smaller gauge wires, but those big 2-knot cables, we don't have the tools to be able to crimp connectors on there. So we actually had those made, and so we want to put a big shout out to Matt at AVC Rig because he was able to do that for us. We had trouble finding someone willing to do that for us. So there was like 3 cables we had to have modified. I think the one coming into the black cable coming into the battery bank, because we wanted to go through the smart shunt, we needed to have that one shortened, and then we needed another cable made to go from the shunt to the actual batteries. And then the big red cable that came in through the floor, just the way the lug was oriented on that cable, it was kind of bottom mounted on the ACR, and on the power distribution block we wanted it kind of oriented in a different way. So we had to have that, the existing lug removed and a new one put on in a different orientation. So Matt did that for us. So thank you very much, Matt. And then we went off and got some other wires to connect some of the other things together. So in order to do that, though, we actually had to order a crimping tool from Amazon to be able to make those other wires that we needed. So while we were waiting, we made some cabinet panel modifications. So on the cabinet where the batteries were, there was no direct way to access those batteries, which probably in most cases is a good thing. But on the lithium batteries, there is a little power button on the top, so you can press it and see how much the batteries are charged. And there's also a reset button, and we thought there might be occasions where we need to get to that reset button when some error condition happens. So we wanted to be able to have a little easier access to that. So the front plastic panel we made into a door. So we had ordered some hinges and a latch similar to what was on other panels on that cabinet, and we made the bottom plastic panel into a door. So then step 8 was basically make all those connections with all those new wires that we had. So that meant connecting the DC to DC charger to the alternator cable. Now at this point we still had it disconnected at the positive access terminal in the engine compartment. And so that was running from the charger through the 6-amp fuse holder through the distribution block to get to the alternator cable. And then we also connected it to the 12-volt bus bar, which essentially connects it to the battery bank. So that went from the DC to DC charger through the other 6-amp fuse holder, through that 300-amp fast-acting fuse to the 12-volt bus bar. Then we connected the smart shunt to the ground bar. So that was just using the existing cable that Matt had modified for us. And then we connected the DC to DC charger to the solar. So another thing we actually added was we didn't want to just have it soldered into the DC to DC charger directly from the solar panels, because we thought we might need to at some point be able to disconnect those solar panels in the future. So we actually put a quick disconnect plug in those wires. So the solar panel wire that's coming down from the roof goes into one side of that plug, and the DC to DC charger wire goes into the other plug, and we actually left them disconnected at this point. Then step 9 is we needed to charge the lithium batteries one at a time. It was recommended in the Lion manual that you shouldn't connect all the lithium batteries together if they're not fully charged. So we needed to charge those batteries up. So we connected each of those lithium batteries one at a time into the system and plugged into shore power and turned the inverter on and let those batteries charge up. Now at that point we also had to make sure the settings were right in the inverter charger, and it took us a couple tries to get that right. We got the voltages that we needed from lithium, so we had that all set up, but then there's another setting that we overlooked at the beginning, and it was setting the final stage in the inverter charger, and that needed to be set to float for lithium instead of multi-stage, and then the batteries charged much better after that. So we got that settings all set up. And so once we had them all charged, then step 11, we could connect all 3 batteries together. And then it was just going into basically testing at that point. So step 12, we tested that the batteries could power all of our electrical systems in our van. So we tested all the rocker switches, we put all the fuse back in and made sure all the devices connected to those fuses were working. Even turned on the S-bar heater, make sure it worked. We tested all our AC outlets by plugging a light into each one, make sure they were all working. Turned on the air conditioner. Well, we turned on the fan to the air conditioner because it was a little cold outside. And made sure all those systems were working. And then step 13, we tested that the batteries could charge from all 3 different sources. So we plugged the solar back in, uncovered the panels, and made sure the appropriate lights were lit up on the DC to DC charger, that we were getting solar input coming in there. Then we, at this point, we finally connected the big cable into the positive access terminal in the engine compartment and turned the engine on and made sure that we were getting power coming from the alternator into the batteries. And then plugged it back into shore power and make sure that still worked. Of course, we kind of knew it worked, well, at least when we were doing one at a time, but made sure the shore power charging was working with all 3 batteries in there. And then step 14 was just reassemble the cabinet back together, and we were all set and ready to roll at that point. Okay, we're going to give you a little tour of the installed system in the van. So we're going to start here in the engine compartment. And if you notice this big red cable here, this is the one that actually goes back to our electrical cabinet. So it goes down that actually runs underneath the van here. I don't know if I can get a shot of it under there for you. So it's that big red cable under there. And it runs about here, and then it cuts across underneath. So let's go in and see if we can see. Now I've got everything, the cabinet all back together, so it may be a little hard to see some of these things, but you might be able to see in there that big red cable that's coming in from the floor. There's also a black cable, that big cable. So then that red cable comes up into the power distribution block and through. It's kind of hard to see back in there, but that's where the connection comes in and goes around, and the ground bus bar is back in there. The 12-volt bus bar is up here. These are those large, I think they're 300 amp Class T fuses that the battery bank, the inverter charger, and the and now coming from the DC to DC charger come into that 12-volt bus bar. This is the other 60 amp fuse that runs from the DC charger over through the fuse to get to the bus bar. This is, oh, I forgot to talk about this one. This is, it's an ANL fuse. I think it's a 50 amp. You'll have to look in our blog post for more details, but this is how the fuse block and the data panel connect into the bus bar. And there's the circuit breaker box for our AC outlets. There's the inverter charger. And then you actually have to come around to the other side to see the rest of the system. Let's see if I can crawl through here. So this is inside the electrical cabinet. There's the rocker switches I was talking about. This is the controller for that inverter charger. This is the switch for our awning. And here is the red arc DC to DC charger and all the wires coming off of there for the different connections. And what we like about mounting this here, as you notice, there's, I don't know if you can see it very well, there's some LEDs on the side here that kind of give us an idea of the status and what's connected and what's happening in the system. So that's kind of nice to have. And then coming down below here is where lithium batteries are. Now this panel is what we converted from just a fixed panel into a door, so we added the latch and hinges there, and that gives us access to our lithium batteries in here. You notice back in here is where we mounted the shunt, that Victron Smart Shunt. And then, so we can, I don't know if you can see that or not, there's like a little button that'll light up and tell us the charge on our batteries. So that's pretty much it. So here are all our costs for the upgrade. So of course there's the 3-line batteries, and that was $2,271.14. That was a limited time sale at Costco. And then we had the Red Arc DC to DC charger, which is $486.87. The 60 amp fuse kit, which was $56.95. The Smart Shunt, which was $136.14. And then the temperature sensor is sold separately, and that was $21.22. The power distribution block, that's the what we needed to go from that big cable into the smaller cable that goes into the 60 amp fuse holder. So that was $37.42. And then the cable adjustments that Matt at AVC Rig did for us, he only charged us $25. So thank you very much, Matt. The cable lug crimping tool that we got was $25.26. That 50 amp quick connect wire harness that we used for the solar input so we could quickly disconnect those, that was $9.35. The cabinet latch and hinges in order to turn that plastic panel on the front of the electrical cabinet into a door was $18.71. And then I just kind of lumped everything else together. It was like wire, the heat shrink tubing, the cable lugs, the aluminum angle we used to secure the batteries in place, and some electrical tape. And that all came out to $76.98. So if you add that all together, it was a grand total of $3,165.04. Now that's not cheap, so we think it was worth it, but you'll have to decide for yourself. Thanks for watching. If you want more details, you can go to the description below and get a link to our related blog post, and that has a lot more details in it, so check that out. And if you want a 15% discount code, that is in the description below as well. If you want to buy, that's for the lithium batteries, the Lion lithium batteries. So if you want to do that, you can get that 15% code, and we get a little commission off of that. So we'd appreciate that. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. We'd really appreciate that. Ta-ta for now.